Good morning, everyone. Welcome. As is often the case, plenty of seats up front. So as you're coming in the back of the room, if you're looking for a seat, you can sort of ignore the reserved seats at this point because our panelists are already seated up on the platform. So my name is Charlie Reardon. I have the pleasure, privilege serving as provost here at Hofstra. I want to welcome you to Day 3 of the 2025 Presidential Symposium, The Beauty of. It has been spectacular, doesn't even begin to describe the sessions from my perspective. Just incredible kudos to everyone involved who's involved in the planning. I'll call some special people out in a moment. But what I really want to highlight, having had the pleasure of attending almost every session in the last 2 days, is how our faculty and sometimes our guests and students and other panelists have really embraced and personified this notion of the beauty of, what really draws us as faculty into our disciplines, into our careers. The keynote, Janet Eckelman on Tuesday, midday, spectacular, as I tell people, mind-blowing. And all of these sessions have been recorded and will be available. And while I certainly encourage you to watch any and all that you missed, Eckelman in particular, I think is just quite an experience. Touches on many of the things that we think about here at Hofstra, whether it be interdisciplinarity, whether it be preparing our students for a variety of career paths and helping them find their own unique journeys. The other point of pride, if I can, is I continue to be just incredibly impressed by the quality, the depth, and the perspective that our students are bringing to the questions that they're asking of our panelists. So kudos to all of our students, and hopefully that serves as a little motivation for the students here for some great questions to challenge our panelists as we move forward. So in terms of specific thank yous, I want to, of course, thank Athleen, Carol, and Janine, the triumvirate that runs the Hofstra Cultural Center. We always give them a great round of applause. Their tireless efforts, it seems like they sleep here this week. Maybe they do get home and get a little bit of rest, but the professional, and I also tell you that our guests that come in, whether external panelists, whether our colleagues they're helping with the sign language, to a person, they just rave about the experience they have when they come to the campus, and so that's in large part due to the Cultural Center team. I also want to acknowledge the four colleagues who served with Athleen as the faculty steering committee to develop the program for the Presidential Symposium. So they're Russ Harbaugh from Herbert School, of course, Jim Lee from H-Class, Ted Siegel from Engineering, and then last but not least, I put her last because she's going to follow me on the stage in just a second, Sasha Giordano, who runs the Hofstra Museum. So really looking forward to today's conversations. Here we are on Day 3. We're going to kick it off with communications, as you know, and a very important topic. And I mentioned to the panelists as I was walking up here that occasionally when the provost gets up here spontaneously, you never quite know what he's going to say. But I'm just wondering if topics around canceling Jimmy Kimmel and the like may somehow weave into today's conversation. But obviously that's for the panel and the questioners. So welcome to Day 3, and I'm happy and pleased to turn it over to Sasha Giordano from the museum to more formally introduce today's panel.
Oh, thank you.
And there she is.
It's like the Jimmy Kimmel Show.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this next session of the Presidential Symposium. I am Sasha Giordano, the director of the Hofstra University Museum of Art and one of the Symposium Committee advisors. In this session, the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication presents The Beauty of Truth, the aesthetic and moral satisfaction in truth-telling. In this session, a panel of faculty from the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication will reflect on their chosen career paths in journalism, strategic communication, filmmaking, and media studies, and explain how the pursuit of truth has played an essential role in their creative and scholarly output. They'll emphasize why it is especially important today, given the current crisis in the country's political culture. At the end of the session, there will be a Q&A. Please use the microphones in the middle of the aisles when asking questions. The moderator for this session is Mario Murillo, Professor and Vice Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. Professor Murillo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, President Poser. I appreciate your presence, as well as Provost Reardon, and the great culture you're creating in terms of creating dialogue and exchange, interdisciplinary conversations on campus. It's really exciting, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. And of course, to the James Browns of our university, the folks at the Cultural Center, they're the hardest working people in the building and on the campus. So thank you so much for this. I wanted to start by kind of giving the origins of our contribution, the Herbert School of Communications contribution to the symposium, which I've been able to go to 2 sessions so far because of other commitments, but it's been really exciting. And to be perfectly honest, my initial knee-jerk reaction when I first heard that the theme was the beauty of, I was like, wow, these guys are drinking a lot of herbal tea or something, because I'm not sure at this stage of the game we should be talking. I mean, I'm on edge. I've been on edge for a long time now, and I said, wow, we're going to talk about beauty. But obviously that was a knee-jerk kind of thoughtless reaction, because when I read the details of what they were looking for, invites faculty to explore and share the beauty they have found within their disciplines, the beauty that first drew them in, that continues to inspire their work, and that animates the questions they ask and the knowledge they seek. And so I started thinking about it, and it was an early, summer day as I was riding in from Jackson Heights on my bicycle. That's my truth, riding on a bicycle, avoiding, cars passing stop signs and all of that. I started thinking about it. I started thinking about myself and how I got into this world. So I'm going to just kind of try to read here so I don't go too much and diverge too much from my notes. I started thinking about why I got into the field of journalism when I was a young adult, like many of you, like Cameron, like so many others who are here who are studying journalism, which was my focus. And I came into it with a naive, maybe overly optimistic belief that thorough, research-based, data-fueled, comprehensive news reporting and storytelling, executed responsibly and diligently with the trusted methodologies of independent, professional news gathering practices, such as multi-step verification, meticulously accurate note-taking, and reaching out to and consulting with and talking to as many diverse perspectives as possible. Those sources of information would help shape the stories that I was working on, right? Could potentially contribute to a rational public conversation about the many complex issues impacting our society in order to achieve something close to what we can call the common good. That there was something compelling for me as a young person. And I certainly, as I was growing up, and I was raised in Colombia and growing up in Colombia, it was beautiful to me, right? About trying to get as close as possible to the truth in order to engage audiences in a way that would benefit our political culture, broaden debate, perhaps even impact policymaking, and dare I say, strengthen our democratic institutions, that is, have an impact and maybe even change the world. Yeah, naive, optimistic, right? The stories that I was focusing on at the time when I was your age, this is back in the 80s, so it's a long time ago, I hate to say it. Movement to dismantle apartheid in South Africa. That was a story that a lot of us as young folks were focusing on in our college classes. The solidarity work that was happening across the country to try to avoid another Vietnam in Central America, as the Central American wars in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and Nicaragua were exploding. Of course, things haven't changed. The Israeli-Palestine conflict was very close in mind. One of my first experiences international reporting was actually going there and spending 6 weeks there and talking to folks on the ground on all sides, not two sides, on all sides of what was happening there in 1988, 87, when that was the first uprising that took place. That was referred to as the Intifada in 1987, 88. Those stories were compelling me to work, were making me want to get to the bottom of it. And closer to home, police violence, police abuse, the murder of Eleanor Bumpers in 1984, 66-year-old black grandmother who was killed by police, shot by police as they were dealing with a eviction notice. Some of you may recall that in New York City. The murder of Michael Griffith in Howard Beach by a gang of white supremacist youth that killed him, and he got hit by a car, and that was another story that was top of mind. The AIDS pandemic, of course, in the 1980s, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, when it started transitioning from being a focus as a primarily disease that was impacting the gay community, but that was suddenly also impacting Black and Latino communities and addicts in the urban centers. That was really painful to watch, and those are stories that we needed to tell. Of course, and we know so many others, the homeless crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So in the process of doing that as a young journalist, as a student, and then getting into my career, I understood that truth in journalism isn't just about presenting facts. It's about constructing a fair, evidence-based, and contextualized account of events so the public can make informed decisions about the main issues of the day that were affecting us all. And today, 40 years later, despite the obstacles, the challenges, and threats, I have not lost faith in the importance of seeking the truth through the field of journalism, although it's not easy to maintain that faith, right? But I certainly wouldn't be here teaching and engaging, working with people like Cameron and others at the radio station, at the Long Island Advocate, in the School of Communication, and all the other students' Center for Civic Engagement. I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't have faith that this was still an important endeavor that we must continue to defend and protect and build and strengthen. But it's not easy in these days, right? Algorithms, tribalism, all of that. Give the people what they want on steroids has made it very difficult. On digital steroids, has made it very difficult to keep it going. So that's, of course, I was thinking about this, and by the time I got to campus, after a long ride, I decided to shoot out a note to everybody in the faculty of the Herbert School. So what do you think? The beauty of truth, right? Why don't we try to focus on that? And so these beautiful colleagues of mine volunteered, and that's why we're here. So obviously not all focused on journalism, right? That's what we're going to focus on, because while I was talking about journalism and thinking about that, I think in every one of the communication fields and disciplines, the question of truth comes up, and it's essential, right? When you talk about communication, it's like breathing, right? So how could you breathe? Breathing dirty air is not good. Communicating with untruths and lies is not good. So in this session, as Sasha pointed out, we'll reflect on our chosen career paths, how we got here, why we got here, and why the issue, the broader thought of truth, how it led us here. And so we've met a few times. I mean, I wish we recorded our conversations over Zoom and in our meetings that we've had, the four of us, and also how Cameron joined us, because those conversations were pretty enriching as far as I'm concerned. I mean, if we had that and taped it, and we could have substituted this panel. But anyway, that's how we got here. And the first question I'm going to ask all our panelists that are here today is the same question. But first, let me introduce them. Scott Brinton, they put me all the way here to the left, so I'm not sure what that means, but I'm all the way here to the left, so I'm going right to my right. And Scott is going to introduce our wonderful student here, Cameron Bowden. But first, Scott, he's an assistant professor of journalism and the newly appointed director of our graduate journalism program, master's degree program in journalism. He's also the faculty editor and advisor to the Long Island Advocate. If those of you don't know the Long Island Advocate, I urge you to go check it out. It's our online platform for off-campus, community-engaged reporting. And Scott has been instrumental in really taking lead on that and making that happen to engage with the community. He's the co-director of our Summer High School Journalism Institute, which completed recently in August. And he's taught in the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication since 2009. He was the executive editor of the Herald Community newspapers just down the street, one of New York's largest community news groups. And he also freelanced as a photographer for the New York Times and as a features writer for Newsday. And he's been doing extraordinary stuff with our students in terms of community journalism. To his right is Professor Russell Harbaugh, who is an associate professor of film production and screenwriting and an independent filmmaker whose work has screened at many festivals around the world, including Sundance and New Directors, New Films. For those of you who don't know, that's the annual festival of the new work of new product curated by MoMA and the Film at Lincoln Center. His first feature film as a director was released by IFC Films in 2018, Love After Love, and starred Andy McDowell and Chris O'Dowd. It was a New York Times Critics' Pick and won the Cinematography Award at Tribeca, a marvelous achievement. And he's still trying to get his a new film off the ground. He's worked on it. It's called Compound, and he's trying to get it into production, and hopefully we'll see that in the big screen very soon. Victoria Semple is Associate Professor of Public Relations and Strategic Communications and Interim Chair of the Department of Journalism, Media Studies, and Public Relations, teaching in Public Relations and Strategic Communication. Her research interests focus on the relationship between mis- and underrepresented populations and the use of strategic communication. And I keep reminding her the key word in her title is interim chair. But we're really happy to have her. She's been a leader in the department and in the school for a long time. And Dr. Jingxi Wu is known as Christina to her students, I suppose, is an associate professor of media studies and is an award-winning teacher-scholar who frequently bridges the two world powers, China and the United States, in her research and her teaching, previously having published articles and a book about how popular culture and politics intersect in powerful ways. Her new book with Temple University Press draws attention to the ongoing rightward shift among the Chinese immigrant community in the US and the role social media plays in that. So I'm really excited, and congratulations, Jingxi and Dr. Wu, for that. I'm looking forward to the publication when it's released. So with that in mind, the first question is why we got into our respective fields, and what about it, or what about the pursuit of truth was kind of the motivating factors. Scott, I guess I'll throw it to you, and we'll just go that way to the right.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me, and thanks for coming, everyone. This is a really full house, so that's fantastic. I'm Scott Britton, and I got into journalism in my mid-20s, and I thought to myself at the time that I wanted to do some good for the world. I served in the Peace Corps. I was into this idea that I wanted to be in a profession that really did some good for the world. And so I joined Herald Community Newspapers as a rookie reporter. 2 months right out of the Peace Corps. And I wanted to sort of convey a story to you about, I think the best way for me as a storyteller is to tell a story about why I got into this profession. And I had been a journalist, working reporter at the Herald for all of about 6 months when I decided to take on my first investigative story, because what I really wanted to do was be an investigative reporter. I came up in the sort of the era of Woodward and Bernstein. It was all that was talked about in journalism class in high school and then in college. I really wanted to be an investigative reporter. So I took on my first investigation, which was this investigation of a recycling plant in North Lawrence. And I basically was taking a look at the sort of the economics of this recycling plant. I think back, it doesn't seem like the biggest investigation in the world, but at the time, as like a person in his mid-20s just starting out and whose like livelihood and life depended on this job, it was a really big deal to me at the time. And, I took a look at all the economics. I did data journalism before it was called data journalism, gathered like lots of information on the economics of different recycling plants across Nassau County and Suffolk County, and created spreadsheets. We didn't really even call them spreadsheets at the time, but created what are now referred to as spreadsheets, and then published a story, a long story after speaking to many different experts about this. And the fellow who ran the commissioner of this particular recycling plant that I was targeting, because he, pretty much everything that he had told the public was a lie, he got really mad at me after we published this story, and he called me, and it was basically this long diatribe of expletive-filled diatribe about how I was definitely losing my job and I was definitely getting fired, and he knew my publisher and I was definitely getting fired. And I sort of got really frightened at that moment because, like I said, I needed the job. Newly in the States, I had to make rent, and I thought for sure I was losing my job. And then this miraculous thing happened, and during this this expletive-filled, angry, diatribe. He basically said, I'm going to come down there, I'm going to take out an ad, and I'm going to tell everybody what an effing asshole you are. And I thought, oh boy, well, I'm really in trouble now. And so then this miraculous thing happened where my publisher came out into the middle of the newsroom and said, I got a call from so-and-so. And I thought, oh boy, here it goes. And he said, he's going to take out an ad, and he's going to call you an effing asshole in the ad. And I said, yeah, that's what he told me. And the next thing you know, he said, that's really good work. You got it, both a story and an ad. Perfect. And I thought, and his name's Cliff Richner, and I thought, my God, that was fantastic. He's not firing me. And then I sort of turned around, and on the back of my chair, there was a target, and this little hand-drawn target. And as it turns out, the fellow next to me, his name was Chris Johnny. He was sort of the prankster. He had put this little target on the back of my chair. And I said, okay, so what's this for? And he said, well, in case when the mob comes, I want them to know who to target. And I said, okay. And I thought, okay, now I'm a real journalist, though, because somebody's gotten really angry with me because I reported on something they said and did, and what they were saying. And the thing about it was, during his entire angry rant against me, he never once said I was wrong. Not once. And he never said, and nobody ever said I was wrong. And so I realized that I'd gotten it right, and I'd exposed a truth there that he didn't want revealed. And to me, that was the beauty of journalism, that I was immediately hooked, and have done many big investigations since then, covered the biggest stories in the country, TWA Flight 800, the crash, the 9/11 attacks, covered that, hurricanes, you name it. I've covered it, done major investigations that have brought down governments, but that one always sticks out to me in my mind because my publisher was so supportive of me, and my colleagues were so supportive of me. Somebody took a photo of the little target, put it up. It stood up on the wall of our newsroom for years, and I wore that as a badge of honor. So for me, it became crystal clear that revealing truths that people did not want revealed, because it was for their own benefit, and not the benefit of the people, that was the beauty of journalism, and certainly that was the beauty of truth.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to ask you, Russ. I know you're in a totally different world, right? In fact, some would think that because...
actually that where Scott ended up is very similar to me. Like I loved the feeling of saying things or exposing things or showing things that people wouldn't acknowledge. Can I just back up for a second, though? Because I want to say a couple of things. The first is that I stutter and that this is a nerve-wracking experience. And so I took a lot of notes because I had a different experience than Mario. Like when the topic for the symposium came up, I was immediately moved by the opportunity. I sensed that it was the exact time to take beauty seriously. Mm-hmm. And so a part of my development as an artist, even before I came to filmmaking, included these two books that I've just been dying to talk about the whole symposium. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes to tell you something that's not an answer to the question and not directly related to filmmaking, just about these two books that I read in college for the first time, didn't really understand, but have spent 20 years with them and can now condense them into sentences each. They're both by an academic named Elaine Scarry. And they're not coupled together. She's written lots of books, but they're great companions to one another. One is called The Body and Pain, and one is called On Beauty and Being Just. And I think they're great companions together because the Body and Pain is about, in a moment that a body experiences pain, she argues that the world is destroyed and a person is trapped in their body, trapped within themselves. And On Beauty and Being Just is she argues the opposite, that in a confrontation with beauty, you are taken out of yourself and into the world. Dr. Barclay Levinson, who's a professor of psychology here in the HCLS panel, actually presented about that there's a biological corollary to this, that in moments of experiencing beauty, there's decreased activation in the default mode network. In any case, I love this idea that beauty removes yourself, takes you out of yourself and into the world and into connections with other people and the world. And the book argues that it's the beginning of empathy, which becomes the beginning of justice. And so I want to read you a paragraph from it. She says, "The beautiful, almost without any effort of our own, acquaints us with the mental event of conviction. And so pleasurable a mental state is this, that ever afterwards one is willing to labor, struggle, wrestle with the world to locate enduring sources of conviction, to locate what is true. Beauty is the starting place for education." I love that idea and sense a truth in that idea. And so I've just been dying to share that. And it is a sort of frame for kind of like my life. I mean, my work as a filmmaker is definitely driven by seeking the sublime, the beautiful, sensations of ecstatic, ineffable, immortal, feeling. But it's also driven by my own personal work, a desire to like expose things that people don't willingly expose, and to tell the truth about experiences that are sometimes difficult. I got into filmmaking after my dad died, and a lot of my early work, but it's sort of enduring work, is sort of connected to that, and kind of connected to the sort of anger and loneliness and desire to like break through what was on the surface. Like, I grew up in like a Baptist house. Like, I'm from Indiana, but my family's from Southern Alabama. And so that kind of sweet tea cover-up of everything, I was around that my whole life, and it definitely came out during the death of my father, like this sort of like gentle, like, isn't everything great? Like, there was this period after my dad died where all the remaining members of the house were misbehaving and getting involved in romantic relationships and sexual relationships that were chaotic. And not just, the young people, like my mom. And there was this, we would all get together, and we would get really drunk, and we would smile and, play loud music. And, there was this sort of like surface veneer of, aren't we a big, happy family? And, that was at the same time that I was developing sort of my earliest impulses as a narrative filmmaker. And I just wanted to break all of that, and say, and get at the sort of subterranean emotional truth of what we were all going through that no one was able to sort of articulate with words. So that's how I got to it.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Vicky?
Hi, I'm Vicki Semple. And so my discipline area here at Hofstra is in strategic communication, public relations. But it kind of piggybacks off of what Professor Harbaugh said, in that I got into communication, I think really because of an underlying thread of when I was in high school. I was incredibly shy and a quiet student, but I always had this curiosity and questioning of, what is being presented to me and why, and that idea of truth. Like, that's not how I see things. That's not how I understand how I fit in with that. And so, sorry, I'm coming off of a cold. So that's kind of where I was as a high school student. And then I got my degree in broadcasting mass communications, and got my first job when I finished my bachelor's degree at ABC, and I was working there at their affiliate news service, and it was great. I loved it. But I always think the underlying issue that always just kind of always bothered me. It was one instance I remember when I decided to pivot my career a bit, was when I was working at ABC News, And a story came across, an affiliate news service basically provides news to all the affiliates. It kind of speaks to what Provost Reardon was talking about with Jimmy Kimmel. That's really because of an affiliate issue, but that's another story. The affiliate news is, how you get your news in other markets outside of the large markets. And a story came down from in New York, and it was about, and some of this might be familiar to some of you, in New York, about an immigrant who was shot 42 times by the police in a case where they said hands up, and he was trying to show his wallet, his ID, and they assumed, I suppose, that he was reaching for something, and he was shot 42 times. And I remember the story coming across the wires and saying, oh my God, we got to cover this. And I was fresh out of college, talking to someone who was above me and saying, we need to put this on the feed. This needs to go out for the evening news. And my voice was not considered. And it was well, the New York Times isn't saying anything yet. And, everything just started coming into my brain, trying to process and thinking about, wow, there really are sometimes gatekeepers. Who is saying, why isn't this story a lead story? I remember trying to fight it, but I was 22. They weren't really listening to me. I had no power in that newsroom. But I remember being internally frustrated and again, having that feeling this is a story that needs to get out there. And this happened in the evening, so it didn't go out at 11 o'clock to the affiliates. Of course, the next morning, the New York Times was covering it, but that's when I learned the power of essentially the New York Times. I realized when they have their morning calls and what they say is the news, the networks tend to try to follow that. I remember that being a frustrating moment early on in my career. But there was other moments that were great, right? But that was just one thing I remember that always stuck out. And then some other stories where I felt like the truth isn't being shared because there's this frame that's set. And if that truth doesn't fit the frame, we're not going to hear it. So I slowly started to pivot away from that job and went on for my graduate degree and started teaching and thinking university is maybe a better place for me where I can do a bit more critical thinking and try to understand more of media, the media studies. So I think to kind of just broadly answer the question, what I do like about strategic communication, which we'll get to later, often gets a bad rep in terms of, truth-telling. But if you really think about it, what really brought me to loving the idea of strategic communication is if you understand the media and the power of the media, and you have a story to tell, you can use that power of the media, which is very fragile, right? It can be used in ways that can give voice to the voiceless, can represent the misrepresented in the right way. But that fragile use of power can also antagonize us, right? And we can see altered images and see these untruths being shared to us. And, it riles us up. It's like a fire in our belly, but that they have the power to set that frame. So I think, when you think of strategic communication and you think about taking the time to listen to those audiences, you have the ability in strategic communication to be more strategic and listen to what's being said. Think about, three things I'm always considering, and this goes to media studies, which I'm sure Dr. Wu might talk a little bit about, is just the media theory, right? Is the person the message? Is the content the message? Is the medium the message? And at any point, you have to ask yourself, how am I going to craft this message to make that impact? What is the best way to do that? So I think, broadly speaking, I really like the discipline of communication because it can give voice to the voiceless. It can be a very difficult challenge, especially in days like today, but you can grow momentum. We've seen huge movements, civil rights movements, Me Too movement, changes in workplace discrimination. And these all happened just by having, organization and strategic communication to bring up the voices that otherwise the media might not be paying attention to, but by being strategic and figuring out ways to get into the ears of the media powers, we can start to spread those words. So that's why I still find the beauty in that in communication.
Thank you, Professor Semple. And in the spirit of truth and memory, the name of that young person who was gunned down was Amadou Diallo. Mm-hmm. I remember covering that way back. It must have been 93 or 94. And so we mustn't forget the names either, right? Dr. Wu.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I want to start by thanking Dean Murillo for the beautiful framing that he put around this panel, because when I first saw this year's call, I thought to myself that my work has nothing to do with beauty. But, since we got together, the more planning discussions we had around this panel and the more we dug into it, the more renewed appreciation I actually gained through these dialogues about my line of work and my disciplines, especially at this very moment when the value of higher education and intellectualism are both under increasing scrutiny. So to tell a very brief story of my background and how my work interfaces with truth, I actually majored in journalism as an undergrad in China, but even though I aspired to also become a truth teller, a professional journalist, upon graduation, I discovered that academia and specifically adjacent disciplines like sociology and communication to journalism would get me closer to truth there. So sorry for abandoning my colleagues and Cameron. So what I really appreciate the most about academia is that it allows me this courage and humility to be agnostic. I know it might sound paradoxical because science, whether it's social sciences, natural sciences, or everything in between, is built on the unknown. And each step we take closer to more knowledge, we actually open up new territories that had been previously unknown. And also truth can be messy, temporary, iterative, and self-correcting. So as social scientists specifically, our job is to really, again, get underneath the veneer, the surface, and look at what is known as definitively as possible today, but it might come off as partial truth tomorrow or even untruths. So it's really this patience and humility with, the unpredictable and uncertainty, so to speak, and the time it takes to discover more and to admit that we just don't know all the answers yet, that really attracted me to my work, to my research. So you see on this slide, well-timed, I threw Obama and the Real Housewives of New York City together, like seemingly very randomly. They all are, reflections of how I try to dig underneath the surface. And when we come back to more questions, how I also try to take a step back or up to look at the bigger picture, to not be constantly caught in the fleeting or the anecdotal. I would love to share a bit more about my research as we move forward with this panel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I want to segue in a way for us to also welcome our student panelist, Cameron, and focus on going back to the issue of journalism and the so-called truth that we might find through the discipline of journalism, but also through strategic communication as well. All presidents, all administrations throughout history, well, we could say lie, right, or twist information to move forward certain policy initiatives, et cetera. It's nothing new, and part of my anxieties, and I say that deliberately, I literally lose sleep, is seeing what's happening now and the way it's like at, tenfold or even more. How the Trump administration in particular, right, the White House press briefing in and of itself as a spectacle, how it has been transformed from a place where, you would have journalists asking questions, and obviously the strategic communication specialist, Caroline Levitt, would be there to navigate the audience and answer questions. But it's gotten to a level where it's almost just about everything that comes out is not true necessarily, right? And it's also been the shape of the room, right, has changed, right? The partisan influencers, fringe podcasters, right-wing commentators are now kind of in the front row asking questions and being picked on, while while legacy reporting has been marginalized, if not even taken out of the room. And according to Caroline Levitt, this is what she said, her own words, this shift represents a long overdue correction of what she terms media elitism and an embrace of authentic voices of the American people, right? And in many ways, that's kind of echoing what a lot of folks and activists were saying in the late 90s, early 2000s when social media was, and the internet was so democratizing, right? Suddenly everybody had a way to communicate with the world. Those are the authentic voices. We need no more filters. Now we can bypass the gatekeepers, et cetera. Last fall, I think it was, during one of the presidential symposia, not our presidential symposium, but the thing for the Calico Center. I think you were on the panel, Scott, Professor Brinton. Ari Fleischer, who is the press spokesperson under the George W. Bush administration, he poked fun at the liberal establishment for saying that you guys don't realize this, but you guys, legacy media don't matter anymore. And it was not so much in lamentation or in recognizing the challenge and problem that represented. It was more as almost an embrace of it as this is a good thing because now it's democratizing the media ecosystem, right? So I want to get your thoughts, and again, anybody could pipe in, but certainly Professor Brinton, as a journalist, when you have somebody who's clearly negotiating and talking to you with untruths, with misrepresentations, et cetera, how, as a journalist, do you deal with that? And maybe you can also convey how you share that with students who are learning journalism, who in many ways that's their reality today, right? They're not used to what the experiences that we've had in the past, right?
Yeah, I guess so. That would be a good time. I will answer your question, and then maybe it would be a good time to introduce Cameron and her work. To answer Mario's question, I was on this panel with Ari Fleischer. I was one of the moderators, and I obviously have to disagree with him. At the time, I was not there to debate him. I simply was there to moderate and take in what he had said. But I fundamentally disagreed with what he said, in large part because this is what I believe. Journalism has been around a really long time. If you think about it, it goes all the way back to Roman times, but in its more modern form, it's been around since the 1600s. And really, in its most modern form, it's really only been around since about the 1920s. But it's always been with us. And I think, as civilization, it will always be with us. Because it's a really powerful force. People have an innate need. We talk about this in my class just the other day. The awareness instinct, one of my classes, that there is an internal need to know what's going on in the world, and there is an internal need to know truth, to know to have good information so you can make good decisions about your lives. And if you look at it, and my belief is that journalism exists so we can make good decisions in a democratic society. Democracy depends on journalism, and journalism is a cornerstone of democracy. When there are those who might celebrate what they believe to be the demise of journalism as we know it, it exists. If it didn't exist, I wouldn't be here. If I didn't believe it will exist in the future, I wouldn't be here. I'd be off in retirement. But I believe it exists. I believe it will exist. And I believe our democracy depends on journalism. And this is kind of a perfect segue to Cameron's story because Cameron, who's one of the best journalism students I've had over the years and has done tremendous work already. And you're only a junior, right?
So, senior now.
Senior, okay. But it's only your third year here,
yes.
Right? Yeah, okay. So you're in your third year here. You're a senior, and she's interned for CNN, Yahoo, and now NBC, right? So, that's just amazing unto itself. And as a student in our 5-year BA MA program, and she was in my advanced reporting class last semester, and at the end, everybody does a 6-week investigation, and when she proposed her story, I was a little bit floored because it was a really ambitious story. And I was a little uncertain, like, are you going to do this in 6 weeks? Amazingly, she did. And she did this amazing job. I don't want to steal her thunder, so I'll let her explain what it is she did. And then we'll talk a little, and then I can talk a little bit about how we sort of refined the story using AI. Yeah.
But Scott, just in the interest of time, because we definitely want to get community questions.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, be very quick. Thank you so much for having me, DiMario and the esteemed panelists. I appreciate it. My piece surrounded the uptick in measles cases here on Long Island, which we were seeing a rise in measles cases across the country, something that we hadn't seen in a very long time. But this uptick, especially due to a fallback in vaccine requirements and vaccines during the pandemic, this story kind of spoke to me because seeing faces of children who died because they were not vaccinated was a really harrowing experience. And so I presented this idea about measles and about, I think there were about 3 cases that were recorded, or maybe it was 4 cases in New York State, and there was 1 out on the east end of Long Island. And I thought, well, where are these measles cases being recorded? It's in anti-vax communities or communities where people don't believe in the science behind vaccines. I didn't term it, but one of my sources termed it the medical freedom movement, or parents who don't agree with the establishment behind the science of vaccines and wanted to be free, I guess, of that, if you will. The actual process of trying to get people to speak about this was so difficult because innately, a lot of this medical freedom community do not believe in the establishment media. They don't believe in journalism as a whole because they see themselves scorched in the media in the past with their crazy, outlandish beliefs about anti-vaccines and not being in support of vaccinating children, and they're very, very distrustful of the media. And I remember trying to get into some of these Facebook groups and posting in this Facebook group, and I remember I only got a couple of responses that said that they wanted to, but I got a lot of responses that said they didn't want to. A lot of responses saying that I was phony, that I was out to get them, that this was just another attempt at legacy media trying to, further scorch this movement of people. And I understand where that perspective was coming from, because I have seen pieces where, the anti-vaccine community is villainized. And while I don't necessarily agree with their perspective in any capacity, I do understand how it can look like and how it can feel to be villainized. And I guess abhor journalists who seek to kind of throw their sources under the bus and attempt to make them out to be something that they're not. Because human beings are human beings as a whole. And as a result, we need to understand and maybe not agree with and respect, but we need to understand where a person's coming from. A lot of the people who told me their stories behind this, article were explaining, very deep and emotional things, members of their family who had, had seizures following vaccines, things like that. And again, while the science doesn't necessarily imply that that's accurate, that is these people's truths. The people who spoke to me, that was their truth. Their truth was that vaccines have burned family members in the past, have hurt people, and they don't want that for their children. So in trying to kind of craft this story with Professor Brinton and working through how do you strike the balance of, well, these people are saying things that are unpopular and based on the science untrue, but still give their voice, a space to exist. And it was a lot of going back and forth between, well, should this be included? Should this not be included? Can we, include sourcing names? Is it okay to keep them anonymous? These kind of debates were really central behind the construction of the story. And by the end of it, I think it came out to be a really, really well-documented piece where it allowed the space for these parents to share their perspectives on how vaccines have hurt their children or how vaccines have hurt them, and also strike the balance of, but scientifically, these are very fringe and very, rare cases of this occurring. And, I think it came out to be a really excellent piece that managed to strike that balance quite well.
Yeah, and it was thankfully, we published on Long Island Advocate, and it was thankfully also published on Long Island Press, which was great. So it had a much wider exposure beyond the walls of Hofstra. And we were able to use AI in part. There was a lot of back and forth, as Cameron mentioned. But, the sort of suppositions and arguments that the three women who were they were all mothers who were making, what you realized pretty quickly is that there was sort of half truths in there, and there were beliefs in there, and then there was just outright errors in there. And so what we and Cameron did to do in this story was to kind of correct the record and say, okay, this is the belief, and gave them lots of space to say precisely what they wanted, and then here is what the science tells us. AI was helpful because we were able to run each statement through AI and ask AI to assess the veracity of the statement, and then ask it for sources to back it up, scientific studies that would then back up its conclusions. And so a story that might have taken, weeks, if not months to do, because it would have required back in the mid-1990s, dozens of phone calls, the same way my mini investigation, if you want to call it, into the recycling took weeks to do. This literally took a couple afternoons to do using AI. So I do have a lot of hope in terms of journalism and truth-telling that AI can be used for a lot of bad things, obviously, but it also can be, based on our experience there, it can be used for a lot of good as well.
Excellent. Dr. Wu, you wanted to add to that?
Yes. Given that the theme of the panel is the moral and aesthetic beauty of truth, I definitely wanted to piggyback on that and say it's one thing to sit in this room and talk about the beauty of truth. It's another to go out there and immerse ourselves in these communities of truth and spaces of facts. So similarly, I conducted a lot of interviews with fellow Chinese immigrants, which reminded me of this kind of long-documented mismatch between the meta, general level data and the personal, individual relationships with truth and emotional reality, which is a term that I picked up along the way. Actually, Dean Luke brought this up last year during our planning discussions about that symposium. People sitting in the room might still have fairly fresh memory of the term vibe session that was coined during the 2024 election, when 54% of Americans surveyed right before the election day said that the U.S. economy was in a recession, when it continued to improve under the Biden administration. So, as trained journalists, creative storytellers and scholars, we try to, look at the bigger, the picture that could be as close to truth as possible. But most people choose to use their instincts or, anecdotal evidence like egg prices to say, well, I get a bad vibe about the economy or vaccine or people around me who have had bad reactions to vaccination. Therefore, I'm just going to go with my instinct and judgment.
Dr. I want to go back to you in a second to go to a point that you made in your introduction, but I want to bring Professor Semple into it to go back to the strategic communication, the responsibility, the ethics around strategic communication, because as you pointed out, very often it gets a bad rap for trying to shape, spin, etc. But that's not necessarily how you see it. But the culture that we're in right now, it says like the more you can spin and get your, the influencers, for example, the better, you're more successful.
Yeah. So to kind of address that issue, the way I present, what I have to present today is to try to look at ways in which we can continue to use the media in a more positive, powerful way. But I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the fact, that there is a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and it's strategically done to manipulate, to have you not question the reality of what is being put in front of you as being false. And so I think that is a challenge, and that is something that is, beyond strategic communication. It is definitely part of it, but that just comes down to ethics, right? Who are the people who are making these decisions and powers, and say that is okay. Go forward with that information. I think, and I'm going to get to my point in a minute, but just to address the issue of misrepresentation and willfully lying outright sometimes. I think that, that just is, unfortunately, there's been almost like this collective acceptance of like, that's just, it's fake, but, that's just kind of how it is nowadays. And, you can't sit back and take that, right? You have to be able to continue to fight. And it's overbearing, right? Like going back to the point of hearing how Jimmy Kimmel was just pulled off of the airwaves. I know when I read that, it disgusted me personally. I am like, well, where are we going? What does this mean, right? But at the same time, I don't feel like we can give up, right? And so I still think that there is a hope and there is power with strategic communication. So like the example I have, it's up on the screen right now, is it might not answer the bigger, broader question that DiMario just talked about, but I think it still gives us hope with how we can navigate and still do good things that still mean something to us, maybe a smaller micro level than this larger economic, political level. But as I was saying, strategic communication can share truths for the underrepresented, hidden, or misrepresented. And so I used the first example with Dove. And because I thought this is a panel about beauty, right? And Dove's always talking about beauty, the Dove, the soap and the lotions and all of that. And so just a really quick example of how strategic communication can uplift and change the norms as to what do we consider beautiful. So, there was a slide that's going around that says, like, what is beauty? And who has the power to deem what is acceptable? So Dove is a Procter & Gamble brand, and they worked along with a coalition of ACLU, amongst others, National Urban League, to create a coalition to start a movement to question who deems what is acceptable in the workplace. And they came up with the Crown Act. And the Crown Act was basically a movement to try to shift and move attitudes and bring acceptance for those with textured, coily hair, and to end, race-based discrimination in the workplace. So whether you have braids or dreadlocks or what have you, that would be accepted. It was not. There was, plenty of stories that you might have seen going viral of, I remember one where there was a young boy playing sports and he was forced to take off, they cut off his dreadlocks before the game, or they were not going to let him to participate in that sport. Which, it's difficult to watch this young kid have that happen to them just because of discrimination, saying that his hair is not acceptable. And so this is an example of where you have a brand like Dove saying, we're going to get behind this, and working with legislators. And so the Crown Act was thankfully passed. It's not across the board in every state, but 27 states have adopted that you cannot discriminate in the workplace for one's hair. So that's, to me, is a little win, right? That's something that came out of really good strategic communications. And the other example I would just show is, a movement we all became very familiar with was the Me Too movement. Tarana Burke was somebody since 2006 who was really trying to fight for the rights of women who were being sexually harassed. And it was like 11 years later when, in 2017, Alyssa Milano, a celebrity, it kind of coincides with really good journalism. At the same time, there were stories that was coming out of the New York Times by two journalists who were discovering what was really happening with Harvey Weinstein. So it kind of worked in tandem. But Alyssa Milano took this idea that Tarana Burke had started in 2006 called Me Too, and simply put out one tweet, like understanding the power at the time of Twitter, and put out a tweet that used the hashtag Me Too. And we kind of all know what happened from there. Later that year, the next year, Tarana Burke was named, the Times Person of the Year. And that also began to have a, that created the impetus for a push and people to come together to fight back, the silencing of women. It helped get legislation that got rid of NDA disclosures. It opened up the statute of limitations in some places. And this all just happened because of work that had been being done, but was not getting that extra push. And that one tweet from Alyssa Milano helped bring it into into the foreground, shone a light on an issue that unfortunately way too many women were experiencing. And then that movement was able to get into that mass media frame. And a lot of the work that went on behind the scenes with legislators and what have you to try to affect change legislatively. And so now there are laws in place that are protecting more women in the workplace. So again, those little wins sometimes I think are what people sometimes miss, what happens in strategic communication that can help alleviate some errors and shine a light on some truths that also should be shown on, like the light should be shown on at that time. Might not be as big and broad as the bigger topics, but those little wins make a difference.
So this is a good segue to, I want to go back to Dr. Wu and the research that you've done. Because you mentioned earlier, I like the way you put it, how knowledge obviously is a process, it's slow, you're constantly discovering new things. And while social media in these cases, we see examples of little victories, as Vicky put it, it works too quickly. It doesn't work at the pace of really finding knowledge and discovering knowledge. And I know during the COVID crisis, that was part of the problem, right? That was a major part of the issues that were coming up around masking, around vaccines, et cetera. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about how your work focuses on that, particularly since you look at the Chinese American community and their kind of shift to the right.
Right. The case study of the Chinese community is additionally microscopic. On top of honing in on the role of social media, we have an ethnic community that doesn't tend to be very vocal, very politically visible. So if you just look at the mainstream media or mainstream social media for that matter, you wouldn't really foresee this kind of rightward shift that actually started to define the 2016 presidential election, and then the 2020, and then the 2024. So within ethnic communities, whether it's Chinese, Latino, Black, right, and men, for that matter, younger men, it felt like the shift was in the making if you go in there and look. I know Professor Herbert actually analyzed films that touched on that very aspect of gender. So something Dean Murillo said earlier about this anti-media elitism, I feel like really played a big role in the foundational rejection of the moral high ground we here occupy as truth seekers, journalists, scholars. If people are already pushing back on us and saying, you are just the elites who think that you know better, you know more, then we're going to go out there and do our own research, right? So now the new catchphrase is everybody's entitled to their own information and facts. It's not even just opinions. Secondly, the Chinese immigrant community is additionally unique in that the anti-China bias is the one indiscriminate bias that both parties, whether it's Democrat or Republican, whether it's New York Times or Fox, right, that all present. So when I talk to these Chinese immigrants, indeed my primary group of research is the recent influx of upper middle class, really educated, and elites themselves, like working in tech, working in finance, working in higher education. So it's very counterintuitive to talk to them and talk about how they support a particular political ideology, how they could be anti-vax themselves. So if the elite media, whether it's Chinese media or American media, whether it's the left-leaning or the right-leaning, which permeates into the American discourse as well, is not to be trusted, then, yes, we're reading them every day. We're still consuming the information. We are operating with facts and truth, but we make our own judgment. That's where I feel like we're really, really challenged.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one last question to the panel, specifically to Russ, to Professor Harbaugh, but I want to remind if any of you want to ask questions, like I guess these two microphones are the open mics, so you might want to line up if you have any questions for any of the panelists. I guess we can start now because the clock is ticking. We have about 20 minutes left. So Russ, I mean, we're talking about news, public information, strategic communication, et cetera. The world of cinema, while it gets hammered for being an elitist and liberal Hollywood and all of that, that's where the imagination sets in. That's where your one worldview, but your heart and your imagination could lay out stories. That would be a thing of beauty. But they also can address issues like of those that we're talking about. For example, political violence, false equivalencies, et cetera. So I don't know if you want to address your work, but I'd like you to address how your work or cinema as an art form can address those in a constructive way that could create dialogue, et cetera.
Yeah, I want to respond to a couple of things and kind of use that to kind of get back to movies. But I guess maybe I'll start by saying, like, yeah, fiction is a moral, ethical tool. So even when it's not explicitly political, it's very political. I think of my work as a sort of, I feel sort of sheepish saying this, but as a sort of resistance work. But it's not explicitly political. But let me wind back to kind of why I think that. Like, my mind is spinning by my colleagues' ideas, which are great. And so I want to touch on a couple of things like this resignation to fake news, that's just how it is these days. That happens in artwork also. Like, the idea that artwork should not be challenging is, I want to say becoming more prevalent, but it's one. You know what I mean? It's like, if your artwork is challenging at the movies, you're a pretentious snob working in an art house, not making commercial cinema. But I think that what Scott brings up, this sort of gleeful, and I guess you did too, this the kind of gleeful celebration of like the fall of legacy media. To me, that's kind of driven by the internet and is, if truth is variable, it can be siloed. And when we participate in our social media algorithms or on the internet, I mean, we are living in an environment that is reinforcing, mirroring our belief system and our values. I mean, that is the danger of the internet. It's the danger of social media. It's the danger of AI. All these stories of AI leading people to suicide. It to me is a exacerbation of what was already in existence with social media. That if it's all fake news and you can choose what you want to believe, it is really pleasurable to kind of live in your silo and not have to engage with other people's belief systems or value systems. Which then leads me to this sort of like human behavioral pattern that I have become familiar with, and you guys are probably also familiar with this. You guys know what a double down is? Like, do you use that phrase? I have been using that phrase for the last 10 years in my creative work, and I just see it all over the place. Just like when someone is, well, okay, so now let me bring it back to movies, because I think this will actually answer Mario's question. So I sort of had a breakthrough this week in the thing that I'm working on. And, movies are complicated things to work on. They're driven by human behavior, but then you also have to think about how you're illustrating that behavior and how you're keeping up the relationship with the audience, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the like behavior, the action, and the thing that I'm working on, I sort of finished a kind of shape of a dynamic, and I kind of work from the inside out. So I start with the dynamic, and then I use the dynamic to try and kind of get to what the actual image of the behavior is, but just to kind of beat it out, the kind of dynamic is an abusive partner delivers an act of aggression, is then challenged by their partner, and instead of acknowledging the wrongdoing and making amends, doubles down into further acts of aggression. So this is the part of it, to me, that I've been thinking about for the last 10 years at least, this sort of growing cultural pattern. I think this is happening all over the place, more often, that someone harms someone else, and instead of acknowledging and repairing the harm, I think because they're accustomed to sort of this like reinforcement culture, doubles down and sort of like proves that they are acting appropriately by kind of like doing more of the harm. Is that familiar to you at all or no? I feel like that's, I've been in relationships where that happens. But so let me come back to this. So an abusive partner delivers an act of aggression, is challenged by their partner, and instead of acknowledging the wrongdoing and making amends, doubles down into further acts of aggression to sort of prove they weren't out of line. Because their aggression continues, an act of reciprocal or defensive violence happens. The person who got hurt, who is now continuing to get hurt despite saying, "Stop hurting me," then responds in kind. "Oh, you're going to hurt me? I'm going to hurt you back." Which then leads to a sort of pearl-clutching, "how dare you, how could you" grievance from the initial aggressive party that then rationalizes further acts of violence. And so you get into this cycle of violence. Are you with me at all or no? Yeah, okay. So can you tell that, like, I'm talking about, like, in a family, in a house, in a movie about, in a drama, but can you feel the resonance with, like, mass political...
Well, it sounds like J.D. Vance's podcast from the other day.
I just mean that, like, it's become familiar to me. Like, I'm working on, like, stories about people, but, I'll get into something like that, and I'll be like, well, that's what's happening out there in a sort of macro way. So in that way, to come back to this idea of, like, my work and the work that I am drawn to the most isn't explicitly political, but I feel like any work that is about taking seriously human motivation and human behavior that isn't shying away from the barbaric tendencies of us, and that is willing to kind of like hold a steady gaze even when you approach something unsavory or unsettling. I mean, that's really important, actually. Like, we need to be encountering stories stories about sort of dangerous, difficult things, because I think it allows us to experience kind of emotional simulations of the world.
Yeah.
Again, anybody with questions, please come up. Rod and Dr. Hill?
Let this gentleman go first.
Do you have a question?
Are there any students that want to go first?
Students? Any students? Thoughts? Questions? I wanted to... No, go ahead. Ask the question. Then I'll follow up.
I just remember when LinkedIn came out, it was designed as a networking thing where we had organizations that were putting people together to work on their careers and so forth and so on. Lately, 60% of what I get is political in nature, written by people whose credentials may be good, may be bad, or whatever. On the other hand, people who are learned journalists, and are writing stuff and have a certain amount of review, you try to read their stuff and you hit a money wall. So many people, you go away from that because they don't want to pay for that. So how do we deal with the fact of a very high level of accessibility to stuff that's not being, reviewed, for accuracy and for credentials and so forth, versus those that go through that review, yet the access is limited because we all want to make a living.
I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that.
Well, there's a great book, News for the Rich, White, and Blue, which is out, and I would encourage you to read it if you're so interested. But to sort of short answer your question, the news, it's very difficult because you're absolutely right. Some of the best news organizations in the world, they're all behind paywalls, and so it's difficult for the public at large to get access to the New York Times. Thankfully, all of our students here have access to the New York Times, so I suggest you get I strongly urge you to get the subscription because it really is a privilege to have it. You get the best news, you get the best reporting in the world, Washington Post, so on and so forth. But there is a lot of experimentation now within the journalism field, and this is part of what gives me hope. Mario and I have been involved with a lot of news organizations across the country that are startup news organizations, mostly online, mostly grant funded, and all free, including our own news organization, the Long Island Advocate, which we are now partnering with news organizations that provide their news for free, and we're providing our stories to them in order to kind of act as a bulwark to make sure that it's like an extra set of hands there, an extra reporter. Cameron became effectively a reporter for the Long Island Press by providing them with an article. There's a lot of experimentation right now within journalism, which gives me hope. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it would be wonderful if the New York Times were free for everybody. I think that would make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And I have a quick follow-up, if I can. I really appreciate the question because the irony, right, is that truth has a price tag, right? Of course, reporters and scholars are not really in high-paid careers to seek truth. But out there, I even talked to my students about how in the 2024 elections, Kamala Harris actually was spending way more heavily on advertisements than Trump, but still lost. So while I was writing my current book, I kept asking myself, so how do we get out of this, right, self-fulfilling almost, right, speaking to ourselves kind of elitism, echo chamber. So I've been attending a lot of workshops and reading books about, say, fighting misinformation and conspiracy theories in particular. And what I keep coming back to is this notion of community-based efforts. So we could throw a ton of resources and money and team up with Taylor Swift or whoever celebrity, but we could also get down on the ground, right? Get into the communities and talk to and ally with the local activists and people who are already fighting on the ground and advocating for truth.
I want to try to wrap it up by bringing Cameron back into the conversation as we close out to get the student voice, and it's actually rounding out how I started the whole session, and it's why we do this. I was, some of you know, I run the Hofstra in Cuba program. We've been taking students, media students, and other students from Hofstra to Cuba for the last several years. This past January was really intense. The situation in Cuba was really difficult, but we met with a lot of people, journalists, academics. We went to the School of Communication there and met with the deans and faculty there. And a number of them were former journalists who worked on Cuban television. And they were meeting with our students, and a couple of them were openly expressing why they left television and why they're just now teaching in the academy. And essentially their point was they're sick and tired of misrepresenting reality. They're sick and tired of towing the party line. They're sick and tired of doing journalism that is not truthful, that is essentially, kind of covering up the crises that the Cuban population and civil society, if there is one in Cuba, continues to experience. And it was ironic because as we were having a conversation with other students and our students, it was like, it's sort of like what's happening here, right? Nobody trusts the media. Nobody wants to, there's so many debates going on, but nobody's really listening to each other. And so the work that I got into when I was a young person thinking of what I wanted to do, thinking I was going to make a difference, perhaps it's not making a difference. So I ask you, Cameron, why the hell did you get into this discipline in the first place?
It's a great question. I still ask it to myself every day. I think much like Professor Brinton said earlier, there's always going to be a need for reliable, accurate telling of incidents and telling of stories. Journalism as a medium is changing every single day. Every single day, new technology emerges, new forms, new everything. And, it's a little bit disheartening at times because, the world that for example, the world of journalism as it's being taught right now is going to be dramatically different in 5 years. You know what I mean? Let alone 15 years, 20 years from now. And journalism as a whole is becoming increasingly polarized, and you are seeing an increase in, this media organization says this media organization says this, and it's, in my opinion, reaching a breaking point in this country. I mean, you have, as we mentioned already, legacy media members like Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert. Obviously, they're more on the, they're not the hard news that you might expect, but they do a lot of the good reporting. They do a lot of, the saying the unpopular opinion and bringing up the things that, people don't want to kind of talk about so openly in the position that they're in. But they're doing that because they see a need to have these kind of dialogues, to talk about this kind of stuff. I mean, it's my perspective that the things that, Mr. Kimmel said in his opening monologue on Monday and Tuesday were not inaccurate to the actual portrayal of what was happening. I mean, he didn't go out and start, railing against, the activist who was killed. He didn't go out, absolutely tarnishing Charlie Kirk's legacy and his existence and all that kind of stuff. He came out and said that, the far rights and conservative movement was utilizing Charlie Kirk's death as a way to score more political points. And it's my perspective, and I think a perspective of a lot of people, that is exactly what's happening here. Now, again, that striking that balance of not letting that influence your reporting while still being able to have your perspective is a very difficult thing to do. But I think that's sort of why it motivated me to continue to go into journalism. I mean, I run my own podcast. I have, plenty of stories that I'm working on, all that, have a need for the community to understand and the community to know. And it's, through the, kind of community-led journalism that's being, headed by the Long Island Advocate, Long Island Press, that, I still see a need for those reliable storytellers. I mean, I'm working on pieces about, the environment on Long Island and how it's, sending people's homes into the sea. I'm talking about, a need for firefighters. I'm talking about sports, which is not even something that I normally do. Every single day that I speak to another person about a story that I'm working on is just another reassurance that this is why we continue to have the need for journalists in the society, whether they're trusted by every single person in the world or not. The need to have a journalist, the need to have a person who is not influencing their opinions and their reporting and is simply just stating the facts and allowing people to make their own assertions and their own observations is more needed now than ever.
Reminds me of how I was thinking about 40 years ago. And hopefully 40 years from now, we would have turned the corner and you'll be talking about this and things will be a lot brighter. But Cameron, your work at the Advocate, at the radio station, here at the Herbert School is extraordinary. And we're really fortunate to have you in our student body. So thank you.
And you should tell people about your podcast.
Oh,
listen.
I run a podcast called Queerly Informed. It's a 30-minute long LGBTQ plus news and commentary show. It's with a team of queer reporters. It's wonderful. We're on to our 3rd season now, and we've started up a new video component because the future of audio is visual as well. Queerly Informed, QUEERLYINFORMED. It's on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube.
As a radio guy, that makes me sad.
I know.
But it's okay.
It's upsetting. It really is.
Anyway, I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank all our panelists. Thank all of you for joining us, and keep it real, keep it strong, stay safe. Thank you.